Welcome to this class. Today we will talk about support, understanding, mutual interactions, reflections, clients, patients' emotions, deeper understanding in the context of transference and countertransference, and we will try to bring all of this information together and see how that applies in the context of a motivational interviewing session, also from the perspective of health and wellness coaching in general. So let's begin. Now, why is it important to understand ambivalence? Well, we talk about ambivalence many times in this class, and we also attempted to distinguish between ambivalence and resistance, and the reason why we do that is because ambivalence is one of the core issues that we are trying to address in motivational interviewing. Ambivalence and lack of motivation are very much connected, but they're not synonymous. Okay, lack of motivation might be something that we perceive. It can be a manifestation, an outward manifestation of ambivalence, and that's kind of the approach that Miller and Rowling had since the beginning of motivational interviewing, since the early 90s. But the point here is to understand where your patient, where your client is coming from, so as not to make the mistakes of misinterpreting what you perceive to be, for instance, a resistance, even more so if you perceive it as a personalized resistance, so an attack toward you as a person, you as a therapist, and so on, or just as a denial, a complete lack of awareness. Okay. If this is the case, in fact, you might have other issues. Even if you're doing everything right, so to speak, from the therapeutic standpoint, there might be some awkward presentation, some friction, some tension that might occur in the conversation as a result of this misinterpreted ambivalence. Now, why is motivational interviewing helpful in this context? Well, one of the reasons is that if you look at the broader picture, so to speak, what happens is that there's a more gentle exploration of the conflicts, motivational conflicts that a client might face. And motivational conflicts, by definition, within motivational interviewing, are stage specific, so that each stage you had to review what type of conflict, what type of ambivalence the client might have. So at this stage, we're not confounding motivational interviewing perspective on motivational conflicts and some other types of conflicts as discussed in psychoanalysis, for instance, especially Freudian psychoanalysis. So the point is to pave the road, not for the client, but with the client, or even better, allowing the client to understand the best strategies to pave the road, to promote progress. And if we find ourselves in the presence of this type of ambivalence, which we might be prone to misinterpret as resistance, this dilemma is actually a crisis. It's an opportunity to see how you can apply motivational interviewing to help not so much resolve issues, but explore, having your clients explore for themselves and see if they can at least contemplate some opposite attitudes in doing that. So we will not dig too deep again from the perspective of psychoanalysis in transference and countertransference, but for now I just want students to remember that transference goes from the client to the therapist. So the client projects, and I'm using projection a very broad understanding. It's not a projection again in psychoanalysis. And from the therapist to the client, if that occurs, that is called countertransference. That can happen in a variety of ways, in a multisensorial way, and that might have to do with conscious memory or not. All right. So anything that goes beyond definitely linguistic communication approach, but sometimes even meta-linguistic approaches. It might even go beyond posture, for instance, and facial expressions, all of which we can, of course, misinterpret because, after all, we are human beings and we can make mistakes. Now, in your slides, I included an example of how to apply motivational interviewing in the context of substance abuse. In previous lectures, I talked about addiction as addiction to substances, drugs, alcohol, but also addiction to people's, places, situation, cognitive patterns. For the perspective of this lecture, we will focus on substance abuse disorders in general. Now, individuals with substance abuse disorder are usually very well aware of the dangers of their substance of choice and how detrimental that can be to their behavior, of course, but also to their psychological and physical health. But they continue to use the substance anyway. Now, let's take a step back here. I don't want people to read this as, but they choose to use the substance anyway, because this judgmental attitude is by definition foreign to motivational interviewing and should be foreign to the vast majority of psychotherapeutic approaches. Not because judgment is always wrong. Ultimately, we need to have a sound clinical judgment as clinical psychologists, for instance, but because in the context of motivational interviewing, the focus is on the client, on the person in front of you, and their ability to develop a higher sense of awareness and therefore be their own quote-unquote therapeutic masters, understanding that they can take charge of their changes. Okay, so they're aware of the danger and they continue to use. Now, where does their free will, so to speak, exist here? Well, they may want to stop using their substances, but they don't want to. And at this point, we're talking about ambivalence. Okay, you could look at it from the perspective of plus and minus. Please do not interpret these signs as a ethical or moralistic, moralizing approach. This is ultimately good and this is bad. Okay, because the judgment should come again from the client. You want to foster their own reasoning about this ambivalence. You just want to allow them to see that the ambivalence is there. Again, on one side they want to stop, on the other side they don't want to. They can also be faced with a choice between two evils, so to speak. You know, we're talking about multidisciplinary approaches, dual diagnosis approaches. So they might enter actually treatment programs and for one issue, but then they might claim that their problems are not that serious, or they simply do not exist, or they're just the ultimate issue on the top of the iceberg, so it's not the problem they want to target. Now, all of this are feelings, or emotions, or thoughts that are natural, all right, and they're very common, and therefore they should not be interpreted as either pathological. Aside from the fact that within motivation interviewing we should not make the call either, but they're not indication of, again, resistance or any type of attack. Okay, we're still working on ambivalence. Okay, ambivalence as having this sort of ability, which is also inability, to put two things on a scale and see which one is heavier, has a more intense cognitive weight on the situation. Now, what can we say now about emotions? A lot of things. I mentioned before that we could use emotions or feelings somewhat interchangeably. One has a Latin or Greco-Latin root emotion, the other one has a Germanic root. But from the perspective of motivation interviewing, we should look at emotions as part of emotional intelligence. So emotions as generating awareness, generating insight, okay? And by virtue of doing that, they actually enhance the ability for change, because they're ultimately relying on the brain's learning pattern. Okay, so they become part of conditioning from the perspective of behavioral psychology. Now, so what you have to do as a coach, as a health coach that uses motivational interviewing? Well, you need to call attention to what is happening. You need to shed light on positive shifts, okay? Positive shifts in the client's words, for instance, but also in meta-linguistic presentations, or the client's energy, so to speak. This is one of the areas in motivation interviewing where you might be permitted to use some spiritual, even new age terms. You can think of the general energy in the room, the aura of the client even, okay? Something that strikes you as important, something that appears to you as a change. Can be a small change in facial expression, a mild smile, or change in the way the client presents themselves. For instance, that they might open up, they open their chest, they're not guarded anymore, and you want to make sure to, again, call attention to these positive shifts. Doesn't matter how small they are in the conversation. And by virtue of doing this, you really are encouraging the client to foster self-compassion, all right? So let's take a step back here. You have encouragement, you have self-compassion, you have acceptance, and you have emotions, all four things. And I would like to spend a few minutes on that too. Now, first of all, encouraging means to really dealing with the heart, okay? So encore from the Latin, right? So cord is Latin for heart, and so you could say you make your clients, your patient's heart stronger and yet more sensitive. All right. So you encourage, you pour its energy, positive energy in your client's heart, and as a result of that, a client should be able to be more compassionate about themselves. Again, compassion. We talked about this before. Compassion is the Latin equivalent of the Greek sympathy, right? And so this ability to feel together, compassion related to empathy, sympathy and empathy, which again has to do with accepting one's emotions, accepting as in grasping them, okay, accipio, right? So the ability to grasp them, to understand them, to know what they mean, what they're telling us, okay? And also see and feel where they're leading us. E movio in Latin, okay? Moving one person, moving oneself from A to B. So an emotion of fear will move me from here to a safer place, for instance. An emotion of happiness might move me to do something more with my life, and so on. And again, we're taking a broader examination of the words. There will be time to distinguish between emotions and feelings, but for now, think about encouraging your client to foster self-compassion and accepting emotionally where they are, okay? Now, this honesty, it's not just a cognitive honesty, it's not just something that we think about, it has also to do with a neurological, biochemical, body-based appraisal, okay? So appraisal of how I feel in my body, how rooted I am in my body, and therefore what I need to do to change things that I might perceive at this point as obstacles, okay? So that I can focus on better self-care. What would be the opposite of that? In your slide, I simply wrote that the opposite is self-criticism, especially harsh self-criticism, okay? Again, a minimum amount of judgment it's not only impossible to get rid of in the mind of the client, it might be even detrimental to have a complete absence of judgment. But we really want to make sure to have this positive disposition toward the client, and that's what it means by radical acceptance, a term that we discussed when we thought about the philosophical and spiritual components found, for instance, in DBT, dialectic behavioral therapy by Dr. Linehan. So harsh self-criticism is to avoid, okay, so we want to make sure the client does not engage and indulge in that. Think about all patterns of behavior, because that will ultimately hinder and undermine insight. So if you want your client to be more aware on side and more honest and emotionally intelligent and develop self-care, you really want to avoid harsh self-criticism. All right, just because we mentioned Marshall Linehan and dialectic behavioral therapy, there is a slide that talks exactly about that. From our standpoint, I want to use the diagram of the wise mind. You'll see there are two circles that intersect, reasonable mind on one side and emotional mind on the other side. I would like to talk more about that, and there's plenty of neurological, neuroscientific research in that regard, some of which might be a little bit over simplistic in their approach, like a right-minded person versus a left-minded person, in which a person with a right mind, a right brain, neurologically speaking, is an artist and only an artist, only creative, and a person with a left brain is only analytical, logical, statistical, and so on and so forth. Now, granted, there are very well-researched differences between the two hemispheres in the brain, and if you can look at the brain diagram, those differences will be very much apparent and easy to understand. I also like students to review the research by Dr. Gazzaniga in this context, a split brain patient, the corpus callosotomy, and so on. But within motivation reviewing, let's think about emotions, emotional mind, and reasonable mind. Now, reasonable mind has to do with rational mind as well, although it's not necessarily the same. Rational as in the ability to create and interpret ratios, okay? So ratio as, the mathematicians among the students will forgive me here to kind of, bring these two things together and mix them together, but as percentages, all right? So you look back at your past experience and you evaluate, you value, and you recreate your past experience, and you see how many experiences were, for instance, ultimately negative and how many were ultimately positive, and you put them on a scale and you see 20% positive, 80% negative, all right? Now, the reasonable mind has to do, by definition, with logic and research and a very, again, rational approach, but within DBT, it's also self-limiting, okay? It's based on observation, empirical analysis, scientific method of what happened so far, okay? Now, emotional mind, it's almost the opposite. It's not necessarily contrary to the reasonable mind, but it's to do, again, with feelings and their cognitive and physical outcomes, or causes, I should say. Within the theory of emotions, there are 1,000 different ways to approach that. I will leave to the students to research this a little more. What causes what is kind of the chicken and the egg problem. Are we reacting in terms of cognitive appraisal to what we observe, or are we first monitoring something, cognitively speaking, and that ultimately causes a biological body-rooted reaction? I will leave that to the students, but emotional mind has to do, of course, with enhanced emotion beyond what is actually helpful to us. So anything that has to do with anxiety and fear and ultimate stress. So between these two extremes, both of which are necessary at times, we find this common ground, reasonable mind plus emotional mind, and in the perspective given to us by DBT, we call that wise mind, okay? And the wise mind is this enhanced appraisal, this ability to think and feel both sides of the spectrum, so that we can have better informed decision making and therefore behavior pattern. All right, so to go to the R, the letter R within our OARS, reflective listening and reflections. So what do this have to do with DBT? Well, we just said that the wise mind is a combination, it's an intersection of reasonable mind and emotional mind. So the wise mind really is telling us, I feel this situation, I feel the issue, I feel the problem, I feel what is happening in my body. I know this, I feel this, and I know this, therefore I will follow up, therefore I will do that. And so you bring everything to the client awareness, you work with ambivalence, you roll with resistance, as we said before, and that hopefully will enhance their ability of the client to navigate their emotions and while keeping their reasonable mind as a helpful element. So what does it mean to reflect in motivation interviewing? Well, reflect simply means to be like a mirror, okay? To reflect back to the client, to also to make sure that you're understanding what the client has said, so to convey active listening, to also make sure that you're not misinterpreting what the client has said, and also, once more, to raise awareness in the client's perspective. So you give clients the chance to see how they sound, how they sound to you at least. Okay, so what words they might choose if they are aware of their choice, what kind of system of belief they might have, what kind of perspective, what kind of values they have. So it's a good awareness exercise for them, for you to say things like, so I'm hearing that, etc. Now, reflection again have to be non-judgmental. Okay, they have to inspire, have to foster learning, and so they have to be non-judgmental, but also focus on any discrepancy that you might be observing during the conversation. So if you notice a discrepancy. Discrepancy can be cognitive, can be emotional, can be semantic, so any type of change doesn't quite make sense in the client's words or behavior, the way they interact, their posture, their physical presentation, and so on. If you do this, then a double-sided reflection will do just that. It will enhance the client's awareness of the discrepancy. So you shed light, you highlight the issue there. And you might do that even with a bit of caricature, the kind of the strong man caricature, so to speak, within philosophy. So you kind of exaggerate it to parts, okay? And so you go from this double-sided reflection. So on one side this, on the other side that, and then you move past that with an amplified reflection that will hopefully trigger a cognitive and emotional response in the client. So the client might reconsider certain aspect of resistance when they hear and see you exaggerating some reflection and this strawman presentation. Now, going to a practical analysis of what reflections we can use, and there are certain videos that I would like you to watch as part of this lecture as well. Some examples, you could start with "it sounds like." Okay, and this is a good sentence starter because it removes both sides of the conversation, both subjects of the conversation, removes you and removes the client from the conversation. So you don't personalize yourself as therapist, as coach, as a psychologist, and so on, and you don't personalize the client, so you don't put the client on the spot. You want to focus on the behavior rather than the client. And one of the reasons that you want to focus on the behavior is, well, first of all, because the behavior is what you can observe, both physically, in the presence of the client, and also based on the client's presentation and what the client is telling you, but also because you don't want the client to blame, themselves for, the possible obstacles and mistakes the client might have engaged in. So if there is an issue, for instance, it sounds like you're not ready to, and then you're not ready to quit, for instance. So it's a statement that contains a reflection in the sense that you're reflecting upon what the client's information states. So you're not creating any new information, you're not educating the client at this point. Again, it sounds like you're not happy with. Now, of course, happiness, aside from being a very broad term, this might be a little personal in a sense that focus on the person. And yet, happiness is defined by the client, so you work on that element too. It sounds like this has been tough for you if you examine something that the client might interpret as a failure, for instance, or a disappointment. Sometimes even failing you as a therapist, as a coach. Let's say you explore some new exercise and dietary regimen for your client. The client in the previous conversation appeared to be very committed to make those changes, and then the client was not able to, and so he comes back to you in the next session and talks about what they perceive as a failure, and so you want to reflect upon that. It sounds like this has been tough on you. Or if the client is not quite sure how to verbalize that, it sounds like you're having a problem with this, or it sounds like you're a bit uncomfortable about this or that. So it sounds like it's a good reflection. All right, so there are several oratory, I guess I could say, techniques within reflective listening as part of the R, reflections in the OARS. One is, again, restating, which we just examined. So it sounds like you're not happy with it, sounds like, and so on and so forth. Rephrasing, and in rephrasing, you're not just responding to what the client just said. You're not responding just to the content of the sentence. You're responding to the way the client presents himself. You're responding to affect. You feel. Now, careful with rephrasing, because rephrasing involves a more personal and direct approach. You feel, and I really encourage coaches, especially at the beginning of their career, to use restating as a primary go-to strategy. What you might do from time to time is paraphrasing, so kind of changing, re-examining, reanalyzing, elaborating on certain sentences that the client might have said. Now, deducing, which is responding to meaning, it's something that we should be very, very careful not to overindulge as coaches. We might do that in the context of psychology, psychiatry, and so on, and it usually really means to give a possible answer to the client. Well, you did this because, you feel this way because. Now, there are certain areas in which deducing could be appropriate. Well, first of all, if you ask for permission, asking for permission is always important in motivation interviewing. You ask for permission to possibly give an interpretation, okay, beyond standard motivation interviewing, and it might be warranted if you want to link, based on your expertise goes beyond motivation interviewing. You have to be very transparent, professionally speaking, in this area. You might link certain behavioral components to certain manifestation at the level of the body. For instance, feeling anxious and feeling that you have a stone or rock on your chest. Okay? This about deducing, again, to bring awareness to the conversation. But otherwise, I really encourage you to start with "it sounds like" as a primary go-to sentence starter in the context of reflection. All right, so in the next slide, both our OARS will do a bit of a summary here. Summaries are actually letter S and in our acronym OARS, so we will talk about that next time. So reflection. What are reflections? Statements, not further questions. Okay, they end with a downturn. They involve hypothesis testing. So you ponder, you wonder, you restate, you see if you understood your clients correctly. And then you also shed light on positive changes, so you are affirming, you're validating the client's abilities, emotions, and so on. And then, of course, you foster further conversation, you keep the client engaged in the cutting pattern, you keep the conversation open, and therefore open to possible changes that might not have occurred quite yet in your client's life.